Good evening, guys. There's a lot going on in the sports world right now, so we're just gonna hop right into it. Starting with the Boston Celtics. If I was a Boston Celtics fan, I'd be scared for the upcoming season. Basically, you have all the assets in the world, something like 16 draft picks in the next 3 or 4 years, and you can't get a deal done for Paul George. If I were a Celtics fan, I'd be pretty pissed at Danny Ainge. He basically could have given the Pacers more than any other team, more than the Oklahoma City Thunder offered. They gave Victor Oladipo, an overpaid player at $84 million, who doesn't live up to that. Sabonis, who can be pretty good, but hasn't really proved himself yet. But you have a Brooklyn pick next year that's likely to be in the top three, a Lakers pick or a Kings pick that's going to be high up there as well, and you can't get a deal done. You don't need to keep hoarding draft picks. In the draft picks don't necessarily always pan out, but you have an established star in Paul George who averaged career highs in points, assists, and rebounds this past season that can make your team infinitely better. If the Boston Celtics would have landed Paul George, they probably would have been the odds-on favorite to beat the Cavaliers in the playoffs. If you add Gordon Hayward to that team, they're definitely beating the Cleveland Cavaliers. But now that you whiff on Paul George and Gordon Hayward just met with the Miami Heat, granted they also met with the Boston Celtics. He's meeting with the Jazz currently, but right now on your roster, your best player is Isaiah Thomas. You have a 5'8" point guard who shoots too much. You can't win a championship that way. Not when LeBron James is still in the East. When he's on the Cavs, you got Kyrie Irving and Kevin Love. Granted, Kevin Love probably isn't gonna necessarily help them win a championship right now. But you can't beat that Cavaliers lineup with Isaiah Thomas as your best player. If you go all in, give up draft picks and maybe even Jay Crowder or Jaylen Brown, you can top any offer that any other team in the league that would have offered, especially the Oklahoma City Thunder when they came all out of left field. So if I was a Celtics fan, I'd be pissed at Danny Ainge. He had the ammunition to get a deal done, and just I don't know if he got cold feet or maybe the Pacers didn't want to go through with it, but I mean he whiffed. He could have had the deal done before the draft. He could have had the deal done anytime after the draft, and he just didn't go for it. If I was a Celtics fan, I would be sharpening the knives. I would be calling maybe for his job. Maybe it's a little premature. I mean, he has won many trades in the past, but if you look at his draft picks, his best draft pick since he's been the general manager has been Avery Bradley, and he's 0 All-Star games. Granted, he's probably underrated, one of the underrated players in the Eastern Conference. But you're also in a weak Eastern Conference. Paul George just went to the West. Paul Millsap just went to the West. You have all these players that are leaving for the West, and Isaiah Thomas, LeBron James, Kyrie Irving, maybe even John Wall are the only stars that are remaining in the East. You could probably throw the Greek Freak in there out of Milwaukee. But I mean, you missed a window. You had a window right now where LeBron James is getting older. Kyrie Irving doesn't play defense. Kevin Love, if he's not shooting well, doesn't really work very well in this fast pace stretch four game that is today's NBA. You had the opportunity to have a starting lineup featuring Isaiah Thomas, Avery Bradley, Gordon Hayward, Paul George, and Al Horford. I mean, and with the bench of Marcus Smart, Terry Rozier, Kelly Olynyk, Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, who you just drafted, that's a pretty good lineup. That's beating the Cavaliers in the Eastern Conference Finals. With an elderly LeBron who might be even looking to move west. Taking his mind off the ball, and I mean that's a pretty competitive lineup against the Golden State Warriors as well. Matchup Paul George on Draymond Green or Kevin Durant. Gordon Hayward can interchange in there. You got to get Isaiah Thomas to play some defense, but Avery Bradley's an underrated defender. Al Horford can facilitate. If you put that lineup together, I mean that's tough to bet against, maybe even against the Golden State Warriors, which I would be glued to the TV to watch. But Danny Ainge just couldn't get the deal done. But moving on to the Oklahoma City Thunder, who essentially won that trade, you give up a player who you gave a bad contract to, didn't prove himself. Granted, Oladipo's an above average player, but $84 million over 3 or 4 years or whatever it is, you can't justify that with the production. And he doesn't. can't shoot very well. He doesn't make the people around him better. He's a poor man's Russell Westbrook, and Russell Westbrook barely makes the people around him better. So that was good, from the Thunder's perspective, getting rid of that contract with Oladipo. But I am a little disappointed to see them get rid of Sabonis. He's a player that it fits the mold of the stretch four. He can shoot. He could probably even play a little small forward. He can facilitate. The only thing is he's got to work on his three-point shooting. But once he does that, that's a pretty formidable front court with Miles Turner and Sabonis. But I mean, when you look at the Thunder now, even though they necessarily won that trade, I mean, I still can't see them being better than a mediocre team. You have Russell Westbrook, who dominates the ball. He averages triple-double. He averaged a triple-double, but that didn't get them very far. First-round exit. I think they won one playoff game against the Rockets, who ended up losing to the Spurs anyways. And you add a player one of my favorite players in Paul George, but he also doesn't make the people around him better. His assists are only around 3 a game for a year. Granted, he does score 20 points, but now you have a point guard and a small forward who don't necessarily make the people around him any better. That's when you have the league that's moving towards a collection of stars on each team. You have two stars who don't necessarily make the people around him better, whereas their focus is getting their own stats. So now that he's ended up in Oklahoma City, I think it's pretty fair to say that you're going to see Paul George in a Lakers uniform. Maybe even before the end of the season at the trade deadline, if things aren't going well. The Thunder just unloaded two, stars in the making, maybe in Sabonis and probably not Oladipo because he had a bad contract. He doesn't make the people around him better. They may be even looking to unload Paul George at the trade deadline, whether that be to the Lakers. I know the Portland Trailblazers were really interested in George before he got traded to the Thunder. So if that experiment doesn't work out, you honestly might see Paul George on the move again. Sam Presti might not want to give up what he did and then lose him for nothing in free agency. So that's something to even keep an eye on. But my bet would be that the Thunder will probably make the playoffs as a 6, maybe 7 seed. They still have to fill some pieces around. They gave up Sabonis, who was coming off the bench. They lost Taj Gibson, who was starting at power forward. You lost your starting shooting guard and Victor Oladipo. So now, you have to fill in pieces around these two players to, maybe even become the 7th seed in a loaded West. If Gordon Hayward leaves and goes to the Boston Celtics and the Miami Heat, the Jazz are probably the only team that falls down the standings. The Rockets are going to move up the standings if the James Harden, Chris Paul experiment works, which I'm guessing they're two players in their prime. Chris Paul's probably towards the end of his prime. But, they're going to be dedicated to making it work. I don't think Chris Paul opts in to that contract where he could have gotten more money from the Clippers if he doesn't go to the Rockets and say, hey, we're two ball-dominant guards. Let's make this work. So, I really think you're going to see this experiment with Mike D'Antoni as the head coach. I think you're going to see it work. You've got Ryan Anderson as the power forward, Clint Capella as a center. He's a rim protector. Eric Gordon's still coming off the bench. Trevor Ariza can always be a defensive stopper against some of the best small forwards and power forwards in the league. And now even the rumor today is that Carmelo might waive his no trade clause to come down to Houston or maybe even Cleveland. That's something else that we can talk about. But I think the Rockets are really going to be moving up. They're probably going to be challenging, maybe even for the first seed, if Kevin Durant or Steph Curry get hurt for an extended period of time. I definitely think that unless something drastically goes wrong, they're pretty much slotted into that second seed. The Spurs might have something to say about that, but they really got to get rid of that LaMarcus Aldridge contract. He really doesn't fit the mold of today's NBA game. When he was a free agent a couple years ago, the Suns were really interested in him. I think the Nuggets were interested in him. The Trailblazers really wanted to keep him. So those might be some teams that are interested in his services. That might have assets that are worthwhile to the Spurs. So that's something to keep an eye on. But so that's top 3 teams in the West. You're probably looking at Golden State, Houston Rockets, and San Antonio Spurs. And the other team, if Gordon Hayward decides to stay with the Jazz, I mean, you still got Rudy Gobert, you got Derek Favors, and you still have Gordon Hayward, who averaged 20 points a game, probably 5 rebounds, 5 assists this past season. He's entering his prime. He'll have a new contract. You got you got a great offensive head coach in Quinn Snyder. They're probably looking like a top four, maybe that 4 spot, maybe that 5 spot, as the Clippers are probably going to drop probably out of the playoffs unless they can really, get Blake Griffin to, facilitate the offense well. They definitely need some shooting. Lou Williams probably is your 6th or 7th man coming off the bench. But I mean, he can't be your primary scorer. Patrick Beverley is probably going to start at point guard. And he's more of a defensive stopper for the guard spot rather than, your primary scorer. But I mean, it'll be interesting to see how DeAndre Jordan and Blake Griffin really coexist this year. As the two primary, as sort of 1A and maybe 1B or 1 and 2 rather than being 2 and 3 or 2A and 2B to Chris Paul. They're really going to get to take over the team. And I'm pretty excited to actually see what Doc Rivers has in store for them. But, they were the 4 seed last year, and you have to expect for them, probably to be competing for that 8 spot. So you got the Golden State Warriors, you got the Houston Rockets, you got the Spurs, you got the Utah Jazz. And the other team, that's really on the rise that I think, is really going to come to fruition with the head coach and Tom Thibodeau is the Minnesota Timberwolves. You got a great head coach like in Tom Thibodeau, great defensive mind. And he was, I don't want to say he was unhappy, but he definitely wanted to add a veteran presence in that locker room to, really groom and maybe even expedite the process of becoming a playoff team with Andrew Wiggins and Karl-Anthony Towns. So you go out at the draft and you trade your 7th pick and you get a 16th pick in return. And, you give away a player in Chris Dunn, who was a high draft pick, 5th overall last year, who had a really disappointing rookie season, but, maybe can show some promise in Chicago. And you give away one of the more exciting players in the league. He won the dunk contest, but he is coming off a torn ACL, and he's probably going to be due some money maybe in the next few years. So that's probably a good person to unload too, in Zach LaVine. So now you have a Minnesota Timberwolves team who signs Jeff Teague in free agency, who I think is an upgrade over Ricky Rubio, who was traded to the Jazz that I forgot to mention before. So you got an upgrade in shooting. He can also create off the dribble. He can run the fast break. He's probably an underrated passer. You've got Jimmy Butler, who can slot in probably in the shooting guard spot in the starting lineup, but can play small forward if they need him to run the second unit. And you've got Andrew Wiggins at the small forward, who I think is probably going to come into a really big expansion year for him. And I think you're really going to see him take his game to the next level. That's something that I'm looking forward to. And you've got Karl-Anthony Towns, probably the best emerging big man in the game, who can really step out to the perimeter and shoot. He can facilitate. He can run. You can run the offense through him. He can pass from the post. He commands probably two people's attention down low, and even he pulls out big men out to the perimeter when he's looking to shoot threes, because he can shoot them from a pretty good clip out there. And the other thing is that the Timberwolves, they have bench depth. You've got Gorgie Deng, who probably will start at power forward unless they make another move. It was rumored that Paul Millsap was going to go to the Timberwolves, but he ultimately decided to sign a pretty good contract for him. 3 years, $90 million at a $30 million average at his age, 31, 32. That's a pretty good contract for him out in Denver. I mean, that's talk about another star leaving the East going to the West. But back to the Timberwolves, I mean, you have a starting lineup featuring Jeff Teague, Jimmy Butler, Andrew Wiggins, and Karl-Anthony Towns. I mean, that's a pretty good lineup. They probably, move from fighting for that, A spot where I think they missed it out at the 9th or 10th spot this past year. They move up to, probably challenging for that top 4 spot with, the Utah Jazz and maybe even the perennial top 3 spot that the San Antonio Spurs have. They're young. They're going to be fast. They're going to be fresh. They got a great defensive coach. Jimmy Butler adds some scoring. maybe even in the fourth quarter, they had the most losses going into when they led by double digits going into the second half. And I think that's something that just comes with age. I really think you're going to see a new and improved Minnesota Timberwolves team. And I think that spells a little bit of chaos for, the rest of the West, especially the Thunder, who have two stars now. Granted, in a vacuum, they're great, but they don't necessarily make the people around them better. In Paul George and Russell Westbrook. And if the Utah Jazz, who were a playoff team last year, lose Gordon Hayward in free agency, which, I mean, it's looking pretty likely. He has a wife and kids. They might be attracted to Miami and South Beach, where you have Hassan Whiteside, who is one of the premier rim protectors in the league. You have a pass-first point guard in Goran Dragic. You have a pretty good wing in Justice Winslow. The Miami Heat are up and coming. They finished the season after going 11-30. They finished 30-11, barely missing the playoffs in the East. So I think they got a great coach in Eric Spoelstra, and a great president, Pat Riley, and Mickey Arison is the owner. They're one of the better run teams in the league. Not just in the East, but in the entire league. LeBron James was convinced to go down there. He won 2 championships. Not saying Gordon Hayward is LeBron James, but it's hard to turn down, Miami. Got no state income tax. It's warm all year round. You got a wife who probably is dying to live outside of Salt Lake City. Miami's probably a great place to raise kids. And Gordon Hayward already has a kid. And he's probably looking to have more. Granted, it's not the same contract that the Utah Jazz can offer him. But it's still a pretty penny to go down there. And the other destination is the Boston Celtics, where, Brad Stevens was his coach at Butler. They went to the national championship game, narrowly missing out, beating Duke on Gordon Hayward's final shot. I think they have a pretty good bond, and that's something that, could bring Gordon Hayward to Boston. So if the Jazz lose out on Gordon Hayward, which, it's probably more than 50-50 that he's leaving the Jazz. The Jazz, the only thing that is, attractive probably for the Jazz is the head coach. Quinn Snyder is a great offensive coach. Obviously, they had some success this past season, but with that lineup, probably with, you're going to lose George Hill, who's rumored to be meeting with the Lakers, who I'll get into in a little bit. But, you got Ricky Rubio, who can't shoot. You got Gordon if I'm Gordon Hayward, I can shoot, but I'm probably not going to be the best player on a championship team. You got Derek Favors, who can't stay healthy to save his life. You got Rudy Gobert, who, is a rim protector, and, emerged as probably, the most improved player this past year. I'm not sure if he won the award or not. I think it was the Greek Freak who won it, actually, but I know he was in the running for it. But, you have a lineup who probably can't compete in a conference semifinals with the Houston Rockets now, or even the Golden State Warriors. So if I'm Gordon Hayward and if I want to win and then go to a great organization that has a great track record of winning championships and having a great lifestyle in any city, I'm looking to go to Miami. But if I want to go to a team who can probably also compete with the Cavaliers for that first seed like they did this past season, I'm probably looking at the Boston Celtics. So you got to look at, there's comfort and no pressure in Utah because I'm not expecting them to come out of the West next year. You can go for lifestyle down in Miami. It's hot all the time, nightlife. But he does have a family, so maybe he's looking to go to Boston where, he can get the same amount of money, he can get 4 years. And, he can probably have the best chance of winning there. But if he signs a 3-year deal anywhere, and in 3 years he'll be a 10-year veteran, so he'll be eligible for that Supermax. So I bet, whether it's with Utah, Boston, or Miami, he's probably going to end up signing that, a 3-year deal, probably around $25 million maybe each year, maybe even $30 million with what Paul Millsap got, maybe even more than that. Who knows? to go somewhere and then, reevaluate in 3 years if the Boston Celtics, whiff on any more free agents, Anthony Davis or, maybe even LeBron James. If I don't think he would go to Boston, but, who knows? Um, they have, all the assets in the world and they, can't get any free agents to come there. So that maybe raises a question as to after 3 years, if I'm Gordon Hayward, do I really want to be in Boston? If I haven't made it out of the East, or if I have and I'm still not beating the Warriors, or if I go to Miami after 3 years and I make all my money and I decide I don't want to live in the heat and near a swamp anymore. Maybe I decide to go somewhere else. He had the rest of the free agency probably hinges on what Gordon Hayward's probably going to do in the next 24 hours. If the Celtics whiff on Gordon Hayward, man, if I'm a Celtics fan, I'm really disappointed. We came into the offseason with all the draft picks, like 16 draft picks in the next first round draft picks in the next 3 or 4 years. You have all the assets in the world to essentially probably get any player outside of, Klay Thompson, Steph Curry, Kevin Durant, LeBron James, any of the big superstars, transcendent superstars that teams would be stupid to trade. And you whiff on Paul George and maybe you whiff on Gordon Hayward. If I'm a Celtics fan, the season's looking gloomy going forward. So it's going to be interesting to see what can happen with Gordon Hayward and what he decides in the next day or so. Hopefully we'll hear soon, and the rest of free agency can kind of play out. But the other team, there's two teams actually that are, I'm actually probably looking forward to the most to seeing play this year. One's in the East, one's in the West, and the first one is the Los Angeles Lakers. It's pretty well known that Paul George wants to go there, and like I said before, you might see before the season end that if the experiment in Oklahoma City doesn't work out, that he could be traded to the Lakers, he could be traded to Portland. He could end up being traded to the Boston Celtics if Danny Ainge finally realizes his monumental blunder. Kevin Pritchard was probably trying to stick it to Paul George a little bit, saying that he wanted to go to Boston, to get out of the East. He wanted to go to Cleveland, challenge for a title, or he wanted to go to Los Angeles, where he ultimately wanted to be. He kind of seemed like he wanted to stick it to Paul George, and put him in basically the complete opposite of Los Angeles in Oklahoma City. But the Lakers are pretty interesting. You draft Lonzo Ball, you get rid of the horrific contract in Timofey Mozgov, and D'Angelo Russell, who probably, once Magic Johnson took over, was probably not in the future plans of that team. And you draft Lonzo Ball, and you have Brandon Ingram, waiting at the wings, who's probably getting stronger this year. He averaged around 7 points a game last year. And he's probably getting stronger this offseason. He's probably working with Magic Johnson. You get Brook Lopez, who's now emerged as a new wave center who can step back and hit 35% of his threes during a season. Only shooting about 5 a game, but he can pass, he can shoot from the mid range, he can work down on the block. But now he can step outside and shoot threes. And granted, the Luol Deng contract probably is still not the greatest contract in the world. But now that you only have one bad contract, you can use the NBA. NBA has this weird rule where you can, stretch that contract out over a few more years, so the cap hit isn't as bad. But he's sort of, maybe a mentor for Brandon Ingram, at the small forward, power forward position, one who can shoot, and be a defensive stopper for small forwards and power forwards. You also have Julius Randle, who averages about 14 points and 8 rebounds in the West. He was rumored to be heading to Indiana and part of a Paul George deal that was offered, centered around the 27th and 28th pick in the draft, and Jordan Clarkson as well. So he's a good player that might be a starter at the power forward for some part of the season, unless the coach there, Luke Walton, decides to take it in a different direction. And you also have Jordan Clarkson coming off the bench. He'll probably end up starting at the shooting guard spot. Right next to Lonzo Ball. He can play defense pretty well. He's a pretty good shooter at about 45%. They're an interesting team to watch because they're still rebuilding. But they have a collection of players that you're looking at right now, and on paper, you look at it and say, in 3 years, maybe 4 years, if you add another established veteran, maybe a shooting guard, that can play defense, or if Brook Lopez moves on, maybe a center like Kristaps Porzingis, one that can step out to the perimeter and shoot. Brook Lopez will be a little older, but in 3 or 4 years, this looks like a roster. The Golden State Warriors will be a little older. This is looking like a roster that should be able to compete. Maybe to reach the semifinals of the Western Conference in the finals, and then maybe eventually compete for a championship. You've got Magic Johnson, running the team, and Rob Pelinka, who both have been around the Lakers organization for years, and you remember what it was like when Kobe was winning, and of course Magic remembers what it was like when he was winning. In 3 or 4 years, this could be, if Lonzo Ball turns out to be the star that everyone pictures, and Brandon Ingram gets a little bigger, he could maybe turn into something like Kevin Durant. He's not quite 7 feet like Kevin Durant, but he's 6'10", and he's long, and he can shoot it pretty well from 3. And he can, once he gets stronger, he'll be able to defend pretty well and take it to the rim. And if you add another star in the next couple years, you're looking at a team that should be able to compete pretty well in the West. And the other thing is that, I'm not necessarily so on board with it, is LeBron James is going to be a free agent after next year. So, you have an established team of young stars and emerging stars, I should say, and you've got LeBron James, who is an established superstar in this league, who right now, if I were him, I'd probably want to get out of Cleveland as well. You just fire the GM. You got no direction. They're not going to beat the Warriors with that lineup with Kevin Love still, unless someone on the Warriors gets hurt. So he's probably looking to get out of the East and get out of Cleveland after his contract's up next year, and he can, opt out of his final year on his player option. If I was Magic Johnson, do I necessarily want, the drama that comes with LeBron James and essentially turn my team over to him? He's kind of whiny and demands a lot. Do I necessarily want that on a team of, younger players? Lonzo Ball is probably going to be the primary facilitator this year. So that might be tough to turn over, but I mean that's something to consider if he's really, serious about leaving Cleveland. So in 3 years, if you add another star, and maybe if you find a way for the LeBron James, that a project of that sort, to work in Los Angeles, I mean, you're looking at a pretty good team. So I mean that's what I'm excited to see. That I'm excited to see Lonzo Ball play this year. I'm excited to see how this young Lakers team, who finally seem, after 4 or 5 years since Kobe Bryant was really competing, for a champion. I mean, probably even longer than 4 or 5 years. And you had the whole Dwight Howard debacle. And there really seems like there is a direction to this Lakers franchise. And I'm excited to see it coming up this year. And I think their counterpart in the East, that I think it is probably the most exciting team that I'm most excited to see this year. And I honestly think that every NBA fan is probably as excited as I am, to see the Philadelphia 76ers play. After 2 to 3 painstaking years of watching Joel Embiid ride the pine on the sideline with his broken foot and lingering issues, we finally got a glimpse in 31 games and narrowly missing out on the Rookie of the Year award. We got to see Joel Embiid, finally show what he can do. And frankly, I was shocked. He can step outside and hit threes, probably not at the, greatest clip in the league, but defenders still have to honor that. He averaged like 21 points a game, almost a double-double, probably, 7-8 rebounds. And I mean, you have if I'm Sam Hinkie, I'm sitting back, sipping my mojito or whatever he's drinking, and looking at this and saying, I built this, give me some credit for this. You've got Jerry Colangelo and Brian Colangelo, basically running the show now, but you've got Joel Embiid, um, who emerged last year as probably one of the up and coming players. Probably you could see him being a top 10 player, maybe even top 5. In the league in the next few years if he can stay healthy. And the player that I'm most excited to see about, probably since LeBron James came into the league, is Ben Simmons. Brett Brown came out and said in April that they plan on him being not just the point forward but the point guard. So you have a 6'10" player with a 7-foot wingspan who can guard 1 through 4 because he's got the lateral quickness, and he's got the strength, and he's got the size, and he's got the speed. He can lead the fast break. He can take it to the rim. Granted, he does have to work on his outside shooting. Probably past 14, 15 feet. I think he took like 3 threes in college and made one of them. So that's something that he can pick up. He's got good hands. He's a good athlete. He can probably pick that up as he goes along. He's probably got a great coaching staff in Philly that's working on that constantly. Even when he was recovering from his Jones fracture in his foot. I honestly think that in a few years we're going to be looking back and saying that he might not be LeBron James, but he's probably the closest thing that this league has to it, maybe aside from the Greek Freak over in Milwaukee. So if he can work on his shooting, and I know he's not a point guard, per se, but that's probably where they're going to start him. But if he were to play his normal position at power forward, that's a pretty tough front court with Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons running the 4 and 5. But essentially Ben Simmons is going to be running the point guard position, and then you bring Markelle Fultz in, who played point guard, but he's got shooting guard size at 6'5", and he's got a close to a 7-foot wingspan, and he can run the fast break. He can shoot lights out, and that's probably why the 76ers wanted to trade up to get him, because Joel Embiid can step out and shoot it, and you got your point forward, as they call it, in Ben Simmons, who necessarily can't shoot, and Joel Embiid probably shouldn't be the primary shooter on your team when he's your center and he's like 7'3". So you got a knockdown shooter who's got a great release. His shot looks pretty coming out of his hands. He's got a great release point. He can take it to the rim. He can guard, taller, point guards. He can guard the shooting guard position. He can probably even guard a little bit of small forward if they're a little undersized, maybe around 6'5", 6'6", around his size. But, you get a really versatile, super athletic player who can basically do it all, that sort of makes up for the deficiencies that Ben Simmons has on the offensive end. People say that he was 9-22 at Washington, but I think that you're gonna see when he comes to the NBA that he is the final piece for that 76ers team, as long as everyone can stay healthy. And I mentioned before, you got Paul George leaving the East, you got Paul Millsap leaving the East. Aside from the Cavaliers and now the Hawks are rebuilding, if Gordon Hayward ends up going to the Boston Celtics, I think the 76ers can compete for, maybe best case scenario that 3, maybe 4 seed if they can stay healthy. That's a big if. Joel Embiid's had the injury issues. Ben Simmons is coming off, missing his whole season. Granted, I think it was more precautionary than necessary. And Markelle Fultz, he doesn't have much of an injury history, but you're coming from the college game to the NBA game. Anything can happen. So as long as they can stay healthy, I think you're looking at a really tough opponent that could really fight for home court advantage in the East. All it takes is one devastating injury to LeBron James. God forbid that would ever happen. Or maybe to Isaiah Thomas or Gordon Hayward if they end up getting Gordon Hayward. And if the 76ers are healthy, watch out. They're fast. They're young. They're big. Robert Covington will probably start at small forward. And he can guard pretty much 1 through 4. He's tall. He's rangy. He's big. He's strong. You've got McConnell. I can't remember what his first name is. Coming off the bench. Who can facilitate, probably run the second unit. He was running the first unit last year, which probably is not what you want to see. But T.J. McConnell. I couldn't think of his first name. But so now you've got him, running the second unit, or maybe even coming off the ball a little bit, facilitating that way. He's a good pick and roll player. With Joel Embiid, and you still got Jahlil Okafor. Granted, he is terrible on the defensive end, and there was a great video clip of I think it was against the Mavericks where he basically just stood there while an opponent went right around him or shot it over him. It was pretty comical. But maybe he has renewed interest in actually playing like an NBA player. He's a great scorer. Maybe he's coming off the bench as your sixth man, and really leading that second unit with T.J. McConnell. I think that's something to look forward to, this season. And the other thing that a lot of people aren't talking about because it's not super splashy. It's only a 1-year deal, but they just signed J.J. Redick, who is one of the premier sharpshooters that this league has to offer. Coming in at 1 year at $23 million. Some people might say that he was overpaid. But, the 76ers have so many players on rookie deals that they're swimming in cap space. The grand scheme of things, if it works out great, next year you can sign him to maybe a more team-friendly long-term deal as he'll, be nearing his mid-30s. But, I can't think of anything bad about that signing. You got a sharpshooter who's coming from the West, who's been not an all-star. He's made the playoffs every year. He's been in the league. He went to the finals with Orlando in 2009. So you have a player who knows how to win, and probably could be a mentor to Markelle Fultz. Granted, they're not the same player, but he can shoot, and Fultz can shoot, and Fultz will probably slot in at shooting guard. So you might have JJ Redick starting until Fultz is ready. And so that's sort of, the one problem with the 76ers is that they necessarily didn't have any older players to sort of, mentor and, kind of show them the way. So now you add, he's in his mid-30s. He's been to the playoffs. He's been to an NBA Finals. And J.J. Redick, who can shoot lights out at, almost 45% for a year, to sort of, be the leader in that locker room. And I think that's one of the really underrated moves in a weak Eastern Conference. And that's another another player that if Gordon Hayward comes over, that can take a young roster in the East and really maybe shoot him up the ladder in the Eastern Conference. And it's also probably similar to the reports today where that George Hill was looking to, maybe sign a 1-year deal with the Lakers, is, maybe slot in as a backup, behind Lonzo Ball, or, maybe even start a little bit until, Lonzo Ball is ready to, really take over the reins, although I bet he'd probably start from day one. If you sign George Hill, he's probably fighting for that, starting a shooting guard slot, along with Jordan Clarkson, who they worked out a lot at the shooting guard last year. But you probably see George Hill, take over that shooting guard spot and maybe run as the point guard on the second unit. So you got J.J. Redick coming to the 76ers, and you've got George Hill, coming to maybe the Lakers, which I like that fit, honestly. Some might say he's due for a big raise after having a great year in Utah with Gordon Hayward. But, he only played about, 55 games or so. He was hurt a lot. He's on the wrong side of 30. But granted, he showed last year that he can still play. He had a couple great years, running as the point guard with Paul George and Roy Hibbert and David West in Indiana. I think, he might not like the idea of coming off the bench on a team that, honestly might not make the playoffs or might fight for that best case scenario, that A seed in the West. You're probably looking at worst case scenario, another 25 win team. Best case scenario, maybe they squeak out 40 games. I would bet if they sign George Hill, I would put my money on them being a maybe a 35, 37 win team, one that really surprises people, and then I think if that happens, you're back to the Lakers being a free agent destiny or a destination that people are really excited about. You have Magic Johnson and Rob Pelinka running it, and you got Lonzo Ball, and maybe George Hill re-signs, and so now you have, after 4 or 5 painstaking years. I'm not from Los Angeles, so I'm not a diehard Lakers fan. I can't imagine what they've been going through, but you now kind of return to those days where everyone wanted to go to Los Angeles for the lifestyle, and the Lakers play at the LA Forum and then the Staples Center. And you now sort of return to this Lakers glory, and they have a direction. And I think the same thing can be said, for the 76ers. You have a weak Eastern Conference. You have a really promising and exciting young core of Markelle Fultz, Ben Simmons, and Joel Embiid. You had a veteran player in J.J. Redick, and you got Robert Covington, who was a steal as an undrafted player a few years ago. You got T.J. McConnell, who can run the second unit in the reserves. You got Jahlil Okafor, who was a third overall pick like 3 years ago, who maybe it will be reinvigorated this year. I think you really have two teams who people have sort of slept on the past couple of years, and rightfully so. With the tanking and everyone kind of felt sorry for the Lakers. But after Jeannie Buss took over, and Sam Hinkie, who really orchestrated everything in Philadelphia, was pushed out. You have now these teams who are part of the infrastructure of the NBA. The Showtime Lakers and the Kobe and Shaq era Lakers and Dr. J and Philly. You have two teams that are really restored to what they were in the past. So that's something that I'm extremely excited about coming up this season, and I think the other team in the East, there's actually two teams that I don't think you can also sleep on in the East now that Paul George has left. One being the Milwaukee Bucks, who I love Jabari Parker, and hopefully he can stay healthy this year. You've got the Greek Freak who showed he's got some of the similar skills as LeBron James. You got Chris Middleton, who hopefully can stay healthy, and excited, obviously, for the whole season. And you've got a core of young players where Tony Snell, and the kid that what's his name? Where he went straight out of high school. He's Thon Maker, that's what his name is. You've got these young players who really center around the Greek Freak. He really fits that point forward, Giannis Antetokounmpo. And I think now that Paul George has left the Pacers, that you have a pretty good looking team for this coming season. And the other team that I don't think you can sleep on either is the Wizards out of Washington. You got John Wall, Bradley Beal finally showed that he can stay healthy now that he has a max contract. The only thing is if they lose Otto Porter to the offer sheet that was offered by the Kings. I haven't seen if he signed it yet or not. But you have a player who shot, I think, third in the league in three-point percentage and is your third best offensive player and probably your best defensive player, at the small forward position. He can really probably guard 1 through 4, maybe 2 through 4. He probably doesn't have the lateral quickness to guard, the one spot against some of the better point guards in the league. But Kelly Oubre is not necessarily ready to take over the starting small forward position. You got Marcin Gortat holding down the center position, and you've got the Morris twin, who can play pretty well at power forward. So I think you have a pretty good team that can probably compete now that with that Atlanta um, is no longer, they're probably rebuilding now. The Wizards can really compete maybe for that top three spot behind the Cavaliers and the Celtics if all goes well. Maybe the four spot if the 76ers are, better than everyone expects. But you can't sleep on those two teams. I think the Pistons are still, they don't necessarily have an identity. The Reggie Jackson experiment hasn't really worked out well. Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, while he's pretty good, he shouldn't be your best player on an Eastern Conference Finals team. Andre Drummond can't shoot free throws to save his life. I don't think they're necessarily a team that might be fighting for a lower playoff spot in the East next year. But after the Cavaliers, the Celtics, hopefully the 76ers pull it together, the Wizards, and the Bucks, I think there's a steep drop off. You have the Bulls who have Dwayne Wade who still might be bought out, but I mean your best player on the Bulls now is probably Nikola Mirotic. And I don't think that's necessarily a playoff team. Now that you've lost Jimmy Butler, I mean, some can argue that Dwayne Wade's your best player, but he's 35 and has had knee problems since he was back playing with LeBron James. Fred Hoiberg's probably not an NBA coach. He's probably kicking himself that he didn't move and take one of the college jobs. Who else is in? Orlando. Hopefully Jonathan Isaacs, pays off, but Orlando has been bad for years, so you don't really see them, pulling it together, and maybe the Hornets with the addition of Malik Monk, Kemba Walker, Michael Kidd-Gilchrist finally stayed healthy for a year, so maybe they can return to what they were 2-3 years ago when they made the playoffs and lost to the Heat. There's that great image of Dwayne Wade, traveling back and forth with the purple shirt man. Maybe they can fight for a 7th or 8th spot. But I would have to say, based on what I've seen so far, Kemba Walker doesn't necessarily have any help other than Malik Monk, who they just drafted and is 19 years old. They don't really have any help. After the Cavaliers, the Celtics, the Wizards, and hopefully the 76ers and the Bucks. There's a pretty steep drop off, and those middle teams that no one really wants to watch on ESPN, and when it comes time for the playoffs, they're just not that interesting. The Pacers lose Paul George, so they're kind of rebuilding again, and the Hawks are rebuilding. So you don't really know what's going on in the East, and the West is crowded. So a good team that might be the 9th seed could be the 4th seed in the East. The Oklahoma City Thunder with Russell Westbrook and Paul George, could fall down and be that 9th seed and beat, probably the majority of the teams in the East, which is probably a problem that the NBA has to deal with. It's going to be an interesting season coming up. I'm excited to see the Timberwolves and how they fare, and the 76ers and the Lakers. Hopefully the Cavaliers, they just signed Kyle Korver to an extension. Hopefully they can get some more help for LeBron James. Granted, I would like to see maybe 2 other teams other than the Cavaliers and the Golden State Warriors compete for a title for the 4th year in a row. Lakers Sixers final would be incredible, but I know that probably won't happen for another 5 years. Rockets Celtics, if they get Gordon Hayward, the final would be probably a pretty good one. Boston returning to the NBA Finals, and the Houston Rockets back to the days of Hakeem Olajuwon and Ralph Sampson, contending again. I'm excited for the upcoming NBA season. I think that you had the NBA Finals and it was a blowout with the Warriors winning, and then free agency really reinvigorated people. With hope for the upcoming season that something else different might happen than the four-peat of the NBA Finals. I think it'd be great for T-shirts and late night comedy. But for the NBA, I don't think it's that great. I think people, especially during the playoffs, nobody wants to watch the Eastern Conference because you just know the Cavaliers are going to come out of the East now that the Celtics don't have Paul George. Maybe it goes to 6 games instead of 5. With the Celtics and the Cavaliers. But I mean, with that aside, I'm excited, to watch some upcoming teams this year. And I think, free agency has really invigorated a lot of people for the upcoming year. I don't think that's something that's necessarily happened the past couple of years. Kevin Durant was last year. I mean, that was pretty exciting. But I mean, when that happened, everyone kind of knew what was going to happen out west, and out east. Nothing exciting really happened except for Dwayne Wade going to the Bulls and Rajon Rondo going to the Bulls, who is reportedly also looking at the Lakers, who would also be a great mentor for Lonzo Ball. He could run a second unit pretty well. And he's kind of that same player. Rondo likes to dribble a little more. But, that pass first, make everyone better mentality. Rondo did, lead the Celtics to a title in 2008. 2007, 2008, I think that'd be a pretty good fit. But, all around, I think it's going to be a good year. And I think a lot of fans are excited this year, and I am too. But the other thing I'm excited about, that was also, I think, got really swept up this weekend because of NBA free agency is the upcoming NHL season. And, being from Pittsburgh, I love seeing, the Penguins winning 2 years in a row. But you saw Kevin Shattenkirk get signed by the Rangers. The Penguins lost Nick Bonino to the Nashville Predators, Trevor Daley to the Red Wings, Chris Kunitz to the Tampa Bay Lightning. But I think you saw a lot of for an NHL fan, you saw a lot of excitement. It was exciting to see where all the players were going to go. The Dallas Stars got Radulov, and they got Martin Hanzal. Patrick Sharp went back to the Blackhawks, and the Blackhawks with a trade to get Brandon Saad again, from the Blue Jackets, who they traded, only a few years ago. So, you saw a lot of these deals, and I think that a lot of people, a lot of diehard NHL fans like myself, are pretty excited for what's upcoming this year. You have a Penguins team who's coming off back-to-back Stanley Cup championships, the first time in the salary cap era. Who might even be poised to make it, go for the three-peat. Right now, the biggest need is a third-line center. I was kind of hoping for Joe Thornton, but that didn't necessarily play out as I had hoped. The rumor swirling around now is that, we might be linked to Matt Duchene, who honestly would probably dominate as a third-line center. I think he's great as a first-line center, but, like Gordon Hayward on the Celtics, he probably should not be your first line center on a championship team. And God forbid the Colorado Avalanche were ever good. They were good 1 year and they made the playoffs. But for the majority of his career, Matt Duchene hasn't made the playoffs, and he's been the first line center. And he kind of got pushed down by Gabriel Landeskog and Nathan McKinnon. If he were to come to the Penguins, I mean, you're looking at Crosby, Malkin, Matt Duchene is your third-line center. You could put him with Brian Rust or Connor Sheary or Daniel Sprong if he comes up this year. I mean, you're looking at a pretty fast, a pretty nifty third line that, will give a lot of problems to teams, in the Metropolitan Division. The Capitals lost Nate Schmidt. They lost Carl Alsner. They re-signed TJ Oshie. They still have Ovechkin and Nick Backstrom, but, they're not going to be as strong. They just traded Marcus Johansson. They re-signed Evgeny Kuznetsov. But they're not looking like they're going to be as good this year. The Blue Jackets are still pretty young. They'll be pretty good. But if you add Matt Duchene, I mean, that's a significant upgrade over Nick Bonino. Granted, you probably have to give up something valuable. But I mean, if I have faith that Jim Rutherford can make the right deal to get it done. And I think he showed over the past 2 seasons, 3 seasons since he's been the general manager, that he has the knack for making the right deals. And, I think Ray Shero in the past made the splashy deals with Marian Hossa and Jerome McGinley and Brendan Morrow, and Douglas Murray and the other players that he brought in. It didn't necessarily result in winning a Stanley Cup. He did the first year that Dan Bilesma was promoted when Michel Therrien was fired. And granted, the Mike Johnston coaching his time as the head coach wasn't all that great. But Mike Sullivan and Jim Rutherford really seemed to click on where the team should be going and the type of players that they need. And I think Matt Duchene, if we didn't have to give up a whole lot, would really work well as that third line center. That's something I'm excited to see really play out. The Avalanche have been talking about trading him for a long time coming. Pretty much as they drafted Nate McKinnon, I don't think they want to pay Matt Duchene the money that he's probably owed. So I mean that's something that's exciting to see, coming up. And the Capitals got a little weaker. The Blue Jackets lost a pretty good scorer in Brandon Saad. The Blackhawks, had to trade away Marcus Kruger. And some other teams around us, really reshaped, and the Devils are probably on the rise, and the Bruins, if they would ever get rid of Zdeno Chara, he's like 47, not 47, but like he's pretty old now, and he's kind of a liability back there. He doesn't necessarily fit the smaller, faster era where we're entering in the NHL. That you're seeing now. The Penguins' identity is speed. You see the Blue Jackets, they have speed now too. The Islanders are probably up and coming with Jordan Eberle, and they got to re-sign John Tavares. But they're fast. The Capitals made it a point last year to get faster, and they're probably sticking to that, seeing that the Penguins have bounced them twice in the second round. The Senators are no joke, as we saw. Craig Anderson, I think, is one of the most underrated players in all of the NHL, and he really showed by taking a very a team that didn't have as much talent as the Penguins did, or even the Rangers for that matter, or the Bruins probably for that matter, in the playoffs. And Craig Anderson and their coach took them all the way to the within one game, within one goal, one overtime goal of making the Stanley Cup Finals. And so I think he really showed that he's no joke. And Erik Karlsson is always one of the top two defensemen in the league. I mean, they're probably going to rename the Norris Trophy after him when he retires. You've got some up and coming players on that roster, and I really think the loss of Mark Mathot was tough. Although they were trying to get him back after they lost him to the Vegas Golden Knights. But I think that you can't necessarily write them off in the Eastern Conference anymore. And when the Rangers have Henrik Lundqvist, you can't count them out. And like I said, the Islanders are pretty good. The Blue Jackets are pretty good. The Lightning are getting better. Steven Stamkos can hopefully stay healthy this year. He's a pretty good player. He makes that team a lot better. He adds a different dynamic to that roster when he's healthy and when he's scoring. And then out in the West, the Ducks re-sign Cam Fowler to 8 years. They get a goalie in Ryan Miller to back up, their goaltender. So, I really think that this free agency period, some people might have been mad that the Penguins won 2 Stanley Cups in a row, and, people might have wanted to see another team win it. But I think that, the free agency period, it was pretty exciting. You saw Patrick Marleau finally leave the Sharks to go to the Maple Leafs, who are another team, with Austin Matthews and Mitch Marner, and, their goalie and Frederik Andersen, who are probably going to be higher than the 8th seed in the East this year. Austin Matthews is the real deal, along with Connor McDavid out in Edmonton. And I think the free agency period really saw a lot of players move around, switch conferences. So I really think you're going to see a whole different league next year. And, the NHL is already the team. You had the 16th seed in the whole playoffs, take the defending Stanley Cup champions to 6 games in the Stanley Cup Finals. And that's different than the Golden State Warriors losing 1 game throughout the entire playoffs. And, before making it to the finals, the the Cavaliers only lost one game too, to the Boston Celtics in the Eastern Conference Finals. So I really think you're gonna see stronger teams all around. And once October 4th rolls around and you have a new team in the Golden Knights, who are they're probably not going to contend for a couple of years. But yeah, I think Vegas has pretty much already sold out all their tickets. So I think you have a fan base who's excited. I think players are going to be excited to play in Vegas. It was tough to see Fleury get selected. He's been in Pittsburgh his whole career, and I think it'll be weird when he comes back. I think it's February 6th, and it's going to be a little different. But I think he's basically the face of the Vegas franchise. I think that's something that people out in Nevada are pretty excited about. There hasn't been an expansion team since the Blue Jackets in the Wild in 2000. So I think that kind of really invigorates the league and adds a different dynamic. But the other thing, the last topic that I really want to touch on that pertains to the NHL is the reported contract extension that Connor McDavid is getting. 8 years at about $13.25 million or $13.75 million, something like that a year. And McDavid's great and all. And I'm kind of biased towards Sidney Crosby in Pittsburgh. But I don't see how you can pay one player almost 20% of your $75 million salary cap and still contend in a few years. Leon Draisaitl is going to be due a raise. Cam Talbot is worth every penny they're paying him. He's going to be due a raise. Adam Larson's probably going to be due a raise as one of their top defensemen. Nugent Hopkins is probably going to want a raise. They just had to get rid of Jordan Eberle because they couldn't give him a raise. As great as Connor McDavid is, and only playing 2 years in the NHL and proving that he's the real deal, probably the heir to the throne of best player in the NHL when Sidney Crosby retires. But I don't see how you can give a player over $13 million a year and still be able to round out a roster that contends in the Western Conference. Granted, the Western Conference probably isn't as great as the Eastern Conference. It's kind of flip-flopped compared to the NBA. They're probably a little closer than the NBA. The two conferences. But I mean, the West is, you got Chicago and Detroit's on the rise, and Nashville showed everybody that they're good, and the Kings will bounce back, and the Sharks re-signed Joe Thornton, and they got Brent Burns, and the Ducks, have pretty much have their same team coming back. I don't see how you can pay a player over $13 million and still contend in that conference and be able to fill out a roster that with good players that aren't necessarily rookies or on rookie deals or undrafted free agents or whatever. Crosby has a cap hit of $8.7 million. Malkin has a cap hit of $9.5 million, I believe. And Ovechkin has a cap hit of $10 million. And people say that's even too high. Granted, McDavid's a center, so he can take over a game a little easier than Ovechkin, much like Crosby and Malkin. But you have a player who's only played 2 years in the league, and you're offering him $8 million. He missed the majority of his first season with a broken collarbone. He did win the scoring race this past season with 100 points. But I think, $13 million it is a little steep, for the atmosphere of the NHL. I would have liked to have seen Connor McDavid maybe take something around the $9 or $10 million, slot where an extra $3.25 million. I mean, that's a second pairing defenseman. The Penguins just signed Matt Hunwick at a $2.5 or $2.25 million average, and he's probably gonna round out their third defensive pairing. Probably with Oli Mata, or maybe they'll pair him at the second spot with Justin Schultz or Brian Dumoulin. But $3.25 million, or even $4, if he takes $9 million a year, I mean that's a pretty good defensive player you can add, or maybe a top six winger, to play with McDavid or to play with Nugent Hopkins, on that second line or wherever. I mean, just personal opinion. I think over $13 million is steep. Even though we saw how good McDavid is. Um, but I just question. The Oilers probably saw 100 points, and maybe the threat of seeing him walk out the door. Maybe learning from the mistake of trading Wayne Gretzky all those years ago. Um, but I just don't see how you pay a player $13 million and it works out in the future. Hopefully I'm wrong. He's a great player. And he carried that franchise this year, and he made the players around him better. But I just don't see how they're going to be able to afford, other star players in the future. People are going to want to play with him. He makes the people around him better. I think people, when you look at Ovechkin, doesn't necessarily, he can't necessarily take over a game the way a McDavid can, or the way a top goaltender can, like Pecorine did in the playoffs. But I think the Oilers franchise maybe jumped the gun a little bit on so soon. He's still on his rookie deal, and giving him over $13 million a year. That's just my personal opinion. But it'll be interesting to see what happens this year. With the NBA and the NHL. I think free agency really, got people excited about, the next couple months. Looking forward to what their teams have to offer, and what the two seasons will bring. You've got the NFL as well, and we have baseball over the summer. But I think the two winter leagues. I'm a big basketball and NHL fan, so I'm excited to see what those leagues bring. Next season. And I'm glad that you took the time to listen to me ramble on about my opinions on the NBA and the NHL. And I'm glad I decided to do this, and I really enjoyed this past hour and 10 minutes or so. And I hope you'll decide to listen in the future. Thanks. Bye bye.